Good morning, Paul. Thanks for having me on. My name is Mandy Feint. I am a major in the United States Army, currently serving on active duty. Been in for 16 years or so. My family is one of approximately 93,000 families who were impacted by the Red Hill water crisis on Oahu, Hawaii. There were thousands and thousands of gallons spilled into our drinking water, the Navy's water line, that impacted, again, thousands of family with jet fuel. And this came from the Red Hill bulk storage facility. It's been around for 80 plus years. I'll be honest, I didn't know about it before we moved to Hawaii. It used to be a classified classified facility. Yeah, it's been going on for years. We weren't really briefed on it before we came. And the native folks of Hawaii have been trying to fight and shut down this facility for many years. And it wasn't until our family was impacted that we really knew what Red Hill was and what had been going on. At the time when we were poisoned, I had a 1 and a 3-year-old, and my husband is also a civilian. We started getting sick in roughly May of 2021, and we found out later that there was a massive spill in May. And then another one in November. My folks also came to visit from Virginia. They came for pretty much the entire month of November. They were also very sick. And so this has not only impacted, my children, my husband, my family, but again, several of my fellow service members and their families, and then, the citizens of Hawaii as well. So it just didn't impact military families. It also impacted the community as a whole.
There's kind of a lot to unpack here, obviously, as you know, because you've been dealing with it. My first impression, having just fought this fight with burn pits, is since we had to explain to DOD and the VA that, yes, it's unhealthy to breathe jet fuel that's been burning, that the logical nexus of the next fight would be to say, by the way, you can't drink it or bathe in it either. So I'd like to say that I'm surprised, but given the track record, unfortunately, I'm not really. Though, obviously, we're sorry that this is the next aspect of how people are being poisoned for their service. This is a little unique compared to burn pits because when we're overseas, you served in Afghanistan, right?
I did. Mm-hmm.
As you know from being overseas, it's one thing when it's just us, but when you throw your family in, then it's a whole new
ball game.
Yeah, that you're not even expecting. And that's not to say that I don't expect that we're not going to have family issues for those of us who served in Afghanistan and Iraq and other places too. But I would expect that to be more of a generational thing where you guys are being impacted right now. I definitely want to get into some of how you got into this fight and what this fight has been looking like for you guys. Just very quickly, I kind of want to touch on something that we just spoke about a moment ago, which is that it's unusual for service members or their families to be able to sue the government. You guys just put in for a lawsuit about 2 weeks ago. And
last Wednesday.
Yeah, and that names several families, yourself included. Can you just kind of explain a little bit of what that process looked like? Because this is a rather unusual event.
Yeah, we think it's the first time in history that families have filed in real time while it's happening. And we hired a really great law firm. I just went past military legal and we hired civilian representation. As you can imagine, there's a bit of institutional betrayal there. So I didn't know at the time who I could trust. So we got signed on with a wonderful law firm, Just Well Law. And we went through the FTCA process, which is a 6-month process where we, filed a complaint. And just to be clear, I am not, just because I serve on active duty, I am not a named plaintiff in the case, or I'm not named in the case. It is my husband, my children, and my 2 parents, all of which are civilians. The only role that I play is because my children are minors, so I'm able to speak on their behalf. But yeah, so we went through the 6-month FTCA process. We made a complaint. They had an opportunity to negotiate, or they also had the option to say absolutely nothing. And so the latter happened. They said nothing. And so we've hit that 6-month, opportunity. And now we have a right to file a federal claim. So we did launch a federal lawsuit last Wednesday. And so there were 4 families that filed based off of just pure timeline and when they submitted their original FTCA claim. But within the lawsuit, there leaves room for many others to file. So it says, the Jane and John Does to come. And we really feel like this is an opportunity to pave the way, especially for our junior families who, have otherwise been sort of suffering in silence. Certainly there's been a lot of retaliation and reprisal out there because we have been outspoken, but we feel like this is an opportunity for, many families who have been harmed, who have truly been harmed by this, for them to have an opportunity, for them to have a voice, and for them to be able to fight for their families as well and receive compensation for the harm that they're experiencing now and that will inevitably happen, in the future with long-term health impacts.
Do you feel that what's been done to clean up and contain this has been in any way sufficient?
No, I don't. I don't personally feel that. I don't know that to be a fact. I can only tell you that although we are out of the environment and we moved on a compassionate reassignment a couple of months ago, we are very tight, and especially being, advocates for this event with thousands of family members who are still being impacted every day. I think I shared with you that we have a Facebook support group, and daily they are posting that they're still getting sick. And I wish I could tell you like for fact, but there has just been this whole narrative of how the Navy has been, so transparent with us, and that's coming from DoD down. And it's what's being told and sold to the media, if you will. And for someone who is personally impacted by this, I can tell you that there's been a lack of transparency, and we are truly, on a wild goose chase. We are truly Aaron Brockoviching our way through this entire crisis because there's very little to no information being put out about this crisis. And, we can get into timeline, but the Navy and the Department of Health for Hawaii put out in March, the water was safe. And I'll tell you that we got sick right after moving back in because we were evacuated from our home. And like I said, thousands of families have still, and are still today as we speak, Paul, like being impacted by this. So no, not at all.
So I'm looking at your Facebook page right now on my other computer here, and I can see a couple of officers who are pinning medals on each other, happy for what you're saying is an award for their response to the crisis. So it just seems like this is just another step of saying, oh, hey, we did something, so that means we fixed it, and now we're done fixing it. Does that kind of feel like what you guys are dealing with?
Yes. As far as the award thing, I'll just tell you that the best way to describe that is a total slap in the face. We had a base commander who sent out a mass email on the 29th of November that essentially said, the water's safe. We're all still drinking it. There's no indication that the water's not safe. In fact, my staff is drinking it today. We have plenty of people who live on base who are still drinking the water. There was just like this overarching narrative that was like, water safe, still drink it. And guess what? I did. Our family and many families still did, because we had at that point no reason not to believe that. Turns out, and we had no idea at the time, but on the very same day, the Department of Health put out a drinking water advisory telling us not to use the water. And at the time, I didn't make a habit. It was not part of my daily life. In fact, I had never check the Department of Health website. So I was not aware of a Department of Health website, but I feel like as a senior leader, if you are contacting every member that lives on the Navy's water line, you're telling them they're safe, and you're failing to tell them that there's a health advisory, or just assuming or erring on the side of we're just going to check that on our own and we should have gotten that information on our own. Like, I think that's wrong. And I think that it is senior leaders' duty to make sure that their folks are informed, and that's not what happened. And that same gentleman was able to, retire with his career intact, receive an award, and there's a bullet point on there for his, meritorious service and, commending him for his action in the water crisis. And I'll be honest, like, I don't know the guy, I've never met him, but he's to blame for my kids being poisoned. Like, there are several people who are extremely upset about that portion of the award. I mean, I'm sure he had an amazing career, right? He wouldn't have been a base commander if not. But that bullet point really struck a nerve with folks. And then I'll tell you too, just personally, for folks who left, who were able to leave the island, whether they, retired early and that wasn't part of their plan, or they left on a humanitarian or compassionate reassignment. Many of those families who left first, and I'm one of them, have been very outspoken about this. And that has not obviously been well received, just based on our status being active duty service members. And we all left without awards. So we've had a gentleman who, Navy SEAL guy that was part of the diving team and went in and like exposed his entire body to the jet fuel. He retired without a retirement ceremony, without a retirement award. Me, I left on a compassionate reassignment, had never had any sort of like negative personal action, anything held against me, left without an award. And the list goes on. I mean, there's so many stories of that. So that was just like an extra kick in the gut. I've never left an organization without an award. So yeah, that one really stung. And it just was a slap in the face for so many families who sort of hold him responsible. Like, he's part of our story forever, that we trusted this gentleman. Like, he had every opportunity to, warn folks to at least be cautious, or at least give us, especially as parents, the opportunity to parent our children and to make those decisions and to be informed and do whatever we thought was best for our family. But we didn't even get that. So yeah, that's a real sensitive subject. Thanks for starting off with that, Paul.
So I don't usually, historically, I haven't done a whole lot of interview with Navy. I think I've talked to one other person who serves there, just since most of what we've usually done has been around GWOT and to some extent there might be one from Gulf War, which, not to say that other people haven't served from those services, because obviously they have. It's just statistically it's been a higher number of people in the Army or Marine Corps.
Right.
Yeah. So you're also unique in that you're taking on this fight as an active duty major, which anyone who serves knows that starting this kind of fight when you're in the service has a lot of potential ramifications, let's just say. So I'll always say on that one is hats off to you. You remind me of this other woman I know named Rosie Torres, who does not back down something that is unjust, and my hats off to you. So
thank you.
Sure. You said November 29th is when you got this email. However, you said that there were two spills. One that was in mid-May, and then another one that started off a few days before that in November. Do you just want to kind of just generally walk us through what happened, and then start to transition? We'll start to transition a little bit to how you got into the fight on this.
Sure. Yeah. So you did mention the May spill. We didn't find out about the May spill until after court documents started being released after the November spill. And so that's a bit frustrating, right? Like, we lived in the house for that many months and had no idea. And we did, to be clear, we had lived in Hawaii on the just, we had lived in this place called Ewa Beach, like outside of military base housing. And we were waiting to get into base housing. And so we moved in, we started doing the transition sort of end of April, early May. We moved in slowly because we're moving on our own. And almost initially we started having symptoms, and those were, headaches. I think I sent you some pictures. Like, my son, he was 1 year old at the time, had, burns, rashes, or whatever down the lower half of his body. And why that's important is because, at 1 year old, we're not like, he's not being submerged in the water. He's only sitting, and just his lower half. And so, we went through several months of just constantly getting tested for COVID. And I can't tell you how many COVID tests we got, like, because that was like going on at the same time. So we at the time, we're reasonably thinking people were just like, man, our son maybe has like a skin issue, or he just randomly has this awful cough that started when we moved into this house, that was never present before. And my husband, for example, who had never had any issues with headaches, or, was having ocular migraines, like seeing prisms in his eyes. And we were just, again, constantly sick. We started seeing some regressive start like behaviors with our 4-year-old, well, she was 3 at the time, daughter. And we just, it was very unexplained, but to be honest, we didn't know anything. We didn't know anything about a spill, so we had nothing to attribute it to. And we just thought, this is just life, right? So in November, the spill actually happened, the massive spill. I think you have a video of that. Happened on November 20th. It was reported to the Department of Health the next day. And it was a spill that it went for like 30 plus hours before the Navy even intervened. And again, we really started finding out about it when we came back from the Thanksgiving weekend. And so at that point, residents were calling in and saying, hey, our water smells like a gas station, like it tastes like our kids are getting sick. We're having all these symptoms, like our house just like smells, we're seeing the sheen on our water. And that's literally how we were found out from other people, right? And on the 29th, which was the day that we came back from Thanksgiving, that's when we first heard like, hey, we're hearing these reports, but they still on that day did not tell us that there was this massive fuel spill. And so self-reporting was originally how we found out about it. And over the course of 2 weeks, I would say, is when things started to unfold in the news. When I got that email from the base commander, like I told you, on December 8th, I got an email from our children's child development center. So we were living on Ford Island, historic Ford Island, right there in Pearl Harbor. And then our kids were going to school to the CDC on base as well, same place that we lived. So on December 8th, weeks after this spill, we received an email. It was a backed-in email that said, hey, on the 29th of November, we've been giving your kid that out of abundance of caution, clean drinking water, and they're no longer using the tap. Well, on that day, like that is the day for me that really the alarm bells and all the red flags started coming up, because I knew that wasn't true. We had just dropped our kids off at the CDC that morning. And as part of, COVID protocol, they come in, they wash their hands at the tap. We couldn't bring in our own like sippy cups for our kids or anything like that because of COVID, and they wanted everything to be supplied and kept within the, in that environment, which we were fine with. But to get an email saying, hey, since like a week and a half ago, your kids have been getting clean water, knowing that's not true, that was really interesting to me. And so I raised that alarm to the CDC director, and she said, not sure we got the email. It's not, obviously that's not true. And we have no indication that the water here is not safe. The next morning, Thursday morning, which was the 9th of December, I had a hand-delivered note taped to our front door that said, the water in your house is unsafe. Do not drink the water. Here, resources is where you can go and get clean water. And then I was just like, I just went into full mama bear mode, because I'm just like, what is going on at this point? And that is when I, fought to get clean water for our kids in the CDC. It's when I fought to have some sort of accountability or apology from the military to parents, because our CDC, where our kids went, was the largest CDC, 250 plus children, and then all of their staff. And from the director down, they were not tracking that the water was not safe. And apparently, now we're being told that there was testing being done, but even the directors weren't tracking the results from that, because I asked. And I said, if you don't know that this water is safe or not, A, how are you still open? And B, why haven't you been giving the kids clean water? So really that week, December, 9th, and 10th is really when I just went full mama bear mode, kind of took off the uniform and said, our kids deserve better, and like they deserve to be a priority here, and we need to provide a safe environment. And we also need to let parents know that this email that they received is absolutely not true. And I fought that pretty hard. And then from there on, there's been other fights that I've sort of picked up, but that's really how I got involved, just fighting for clean water for our kids.
So CDC, that's Child Development Center, right?
Yeah.
And you're talking about they were basically reusing plastic sippy cups, right?
Yes.
And you and I talked about this when we first spoke, I think on day one. They beat into our heads pretty early on, particularly when we were in the field, that there is a separate 5-gallon drum for fuel than there is for water. And if you ever put fuel into the water canister, that canister needs to be taken out of commission, because fuel bonds to plastic and then will continue to leach out into whatever's ingested from it. That's your understanding as well?
Absolutely. So, yes. So my daughter ended up in the hospital on the 13th of December. And we had I wish I had one here. We had a plastic sippy cup. And the ER doctor told me, hey, ma'am, that cup, although it might be, have you ever washed that cup in your home before, like during this crisis? And I said, yeah, absolutely. But we've washed it. And he was like, here's what you need to know about personal use plastics. And he explained just sort of what you just did. And again, like not a water expert, didn't think twice about it. He said clean water and a previously contaminated cup does not equal clean water. So, and he said these words to me, like, you might actually still be poisoning your own child. And as a mother, I mean, you're as no parent wants to hear that. And I was, obviously I live with a lot of mom guilt about that, but I was also angry because I mentioned earlier, we're Erin Brockoviching our way. Like, this information was not being fed to us. Like, hey, if you're, you have small children, toss out these personal use plastics and get new things. Like, we were never told any of that. And so, yeah, that was really frustrating. And that was the next fight. It transitioned to the next fight. I said that, I spoke at town halls. I tried to get the CDCs. Like, I met with the CDC director. I met with the overall CYP, Child and Youth Programs director. Then I went to the overall MWR director and said, hey guys, like, this isn't for me to figure out. Like, this is not my job, but I will do this job if it need be. Like, you've got to shut down these facilities, and you have to replace these personal use plastics and other porous materials, right? So, if they're washing the kids' blankets, for example, that they were using every day during nap time in contaminated water, those need to be tossed out. Teething toys, like my child was 1 year old, teething, right? Prime teething age. And I'm like, he doesn't have the ability to say, hey, Miss Sam, who was his instructor at the time, like, this tastes like jet fuel, right? Like, we need to do better than that for our children. He didn't have the vocabulary. And so, yeah, I went to a town hall once, and I said, and it was a panel full of, 06 colonels and general officers. And I said, gentlemen, with all due respect, would you drink water out of a previously used red gas can? Because that's what we're asking our kids to do. That's what we're asking for our child development centers to do. And until you shut this down or completely, to replace the person who's plastics and porous materials in a CDC is a drop in the bucket compared to the overall Department of Defense budget and the amount of money that was allotted to clean up Red Hill. And the fact that I received so much resistance about that, like, I had people saying, well, Major Fight, as long as you're washing it with clean soapy water. And I'm like, yeah, guy, like, I get it. Like, that's exactly what I'm doing. But, and then he was like, and I can send you the recording of this. I'd love for you to play this. But, he was like, we hope that you're doing that. And then, give it the old smell or taste test. And, if so, wash it again. If not, then maybe toss it. And that's why I go back to these CDC teachers, they've got 7 to 10 to 1 ratios. Do you think that they have time to chew on teething toys and like drink out of these cups or sniff them every time before they're given to kids? Like, they're barely keeping their head above water there, right? Understaffed, underpaid, and that's not their job. Like, the right answer is to replace these use plastics, to replace the porous materials, and create a safe environment for our children. Our children that are on a military base, that's an extra layer of security that we as parents, as military parents, feel, and we can't even get like a safe environment for our kids. So I yanked my kids out of that CDC, and I was left with no childcare, and that became a huge point of contention with me returning to work. But first of all, there's a health advisory for that education center, and then we just felt as parents, that at that point we were no longer going to allow the Navy to gamble on our children's lives, and the environment in which those kids were in was unsafe.
In working in hardware, which is one of my various backgrounds, when you put piping through a house, usually you use for water galvanized steel, copper pipe, and PVC. And it seems like a lot of times people favor PVC. But even if you have, say, copper piping, which I don't know what the ratio of being able to clean copper up versus the other metals, most parts still have PVC in them. So kind of like what we look at in healthcare as far as contact diseases is you have to break the chain of contact in order to effectively get it out. So even if they have replaced the sippy cups then there would still be piping and water heaters, washers and dryers. They're already effectively contaminated by all this. So really, in order to fix this all, it sounds like they would have to fix the source and then replace all the said components leading up to from that facility going to your child's sippy cup, which I also noted in your lawsuit that it points out that they were using CPC or PVC piping to transmit their fuel, which is not recommended either, and maybe a factor into how some of this happened. So,
if you watch that video, Paul, you can see the gasoline or the fuel and water mixture coming out of a broken PVC pipe.
Yes. Yeah, and you can see where it took a knock to it because it looks, offhand, as best as I can tell from a little video, it looks like it's a little stress fracture on the stem itself, possibly indicating it got whacked, which is one of the speculations, but hard to know. Which, you find it interesting that someone thought to take a video of this because apparently it didn't seem right, yet it took, a day and a half, 2 days to even shut the source off. And I'm not saying it's necessarily that easy because if it's all in one circuit and that's your only shut off, one, I question if that's a flawed system in and of itself, but at some point, what do you do to shut the whole thing off and stop it from getting everywhere? Plus, I would think that people going through those tunnels don't want to get blown up. But
right.
So, I'm kind of looking around, and it looks like House Resolution, according to this one press release, 6617 was put out, which was to include quite a bit of spending for this water crisis. Do you want to start getting into what it looks like with the Navy's cleanup effort?
In the beginning, we were, I think it was on the 30th of November, received an email that said, after the 29th email, so like the day before, we were like, hey, the water's safe. The next day we get this random email again. Again, every resident is getting these emails from the base. And we're being told as residents to flush our own water systems. And we get, instructions on how to do that. And I'm like, well, there's nothing wrong with water. And then like, why are we flushing our systems? Like, what's going on here, And again, everything was like briefed to us by like, out of abundance of caution, if I never have to hear that again. Ugh. Anyhow, so we also were given the ability to call the EOC, the Emergency Operations Center, and say, hey, we think something might be wrong with our water, has a smell, a taste, a sheen, whatever. Can you come out and test our water? And our home was actually tested on the 10th of December. We never to this day have received those test results. But I don't think we've talked since this happened, but a couple of days ago, Sosie Koch, who writes for the Star Advisor, Honolulu Star Advisor, broke a story, it really dropped a bomb, if you will, that in the beginning, until the Navy started, bringing in the GAC systems and doing like massive flushing operations, they were only testing, for the better half of December, they were only testing for TOC, so total organic compounds. And our home was tested for TOC. When I was like, okay, cool. And it apparently came up as a non-detect, which I was like, awesome. So I just believed that it was tested for petroleum, which we knew was the source of contamination. And guess what we found out just a couple of days ago on the front page of the Star Advisor is that, Advertiser, they didn't even test for petroleum. That test does not test for petroleum. They didn't start testing for TPH, total petroleum hydrocarbons, until after they started massive community flushing operations. And by that, I mean, before they brought in the GACs, they were, there would be days that our sprinkler systems would be, going off. Days, I'm not exaggerating. Fire hydrants would just be dumping, gushing water into the streets. Like yards were flooded. Sewers were like getting, just too much. It was just awful. And then after all of that, that's when they started testing for TPH. You'll also see in Sophie's article that not only were they not testing for petroleum, the Navy, made a statement in that article that says, they dumped a bunch of the samples because they didn't have enough people. And essentially they knew that petroleum was in the water and they were just trying to see if there was anything else. So what pisses me off about that is that I will never know to the extent, that like what we were drinking, what was truly in our water, what made our children sick. I'll never have that closure. I'll never know. And that, as a mother, that makes me angry, because somehow you think, or you thought, that you reserved the right to know more about what my children were exposed to than I did as a parent. That's upsetting. But back to the cleanup. So in December, they brought in these GAC systems. Don't ask me what that stands for. You'll have to look it up. But they brought in the GAC systems, and they started doing these community-wide flushes. And in the beginning, it failed. Like, so AMR, which is the only Army housing area on the Navy's water line, they did, community flush, with the GAC, and it failed. And so the protocol was initially that community flush would happen. The residents would be presented with those results to know that, okay, before we start bringing military members in to flush the systems, your individual systems, you would know the results from the community flush. That did not happen after AMR failed. And that was something that was my third fight. I guess we're number 3 in the fight now. These military folks showed up to our house and were trying to come in and do an individual flush on our home. And I said, you're not coming in my house, because although I do live in a military base house, all of my things, like my kids, his crib, like, all of our things are still in there. So until you give me the test results, which is what the protocol is, you're not coming in, because you're not flushing contaminated water through my house again and like re-contaminating, re-exposing us. Not only that, our personal things, but like those junior grade soldiers who they had coming in, they're not water experts. They're just like, right? Like, they're just on a detail because they're the most junior people, and they're just doing what they're told. And I asked a bunch of them that day, I said, have you been told that the water that you're handling is safe or not? And none of them had an answer. None of them had proper PPE. They just had like the regular military uniform on. Some of them had masks, because we were in the middle of COVID. So they had like a COVID mask on. Some had gloves, some did not. Some had iPro, some did not. But like, bottom line is they weren't given proper PPE, and I was not going to be responsible for those kids coming in, those soldiers coming into my home, not knowing if the water was safe, not for our own personal health and safety, but for them as well. Eventually I was overruled on that, got counseled for it, and was told, whether I liked it or not, that they were coming in our house to flush. And so that was like a huge point of contention. And that's where really things started going south for me as far as retaliation. But yeah, they did these community flush, individual flush, doing testing for TPH at that point. They were sending the test results, the test to EPA approved labs in the mainland. They would take several weeks to come back. All of that happened over the course of several months. And then finally, mid-March, all of the housing areas were deemed safe. And one thing I forgot to mention is that, we were authorized to, move out of our homes. We were essentially evacuated, and we were staying, in hotels down in Waikiki. So for us, in March, first of all, I was hospitalized when our house got deemed safe to move back in. So we didn't move back in right away. And before we moved back in, we had our house tested. We had our house tested for air quality, like our air quality tested, because the military refused to do that. So we paid out of pocket for that. And of course, we didn't get those test results for some time. The problem with that is not only for our family, but, for other folks, you sort of had to made a decision. I said this a couple of times, like, trust the Navy again when they say your home is safe, to move back in, and like allow them to gamble again on your family's life, or go in debt. Because I don't know if you've ever stayed in Waikiki, but it is freaking expensive. And I remember on the holidays, it was, upwards of $800 to $900 a night for a hotel room. And so once the military said your house is safe, they were no longer going to, back pay you or compensate you for that hotel room. And so, yeah, you were sort of like this decision, gamble on my family's life again, or go in debt, because we can't afford to keep living in a hotel. So naturally, everyone moves back into their home, and many people got sick almost immediately and have remained sick and are still sick as we speak today. So now, yes, they are testing for TPH, but in the beginning, they were not. And so, at this point, and I said to Sophie, like, I'll never know. We'll never know how much fuel our kids drank, were exposed to, bathed in, cooked with, breathed in, every night when they went to sleep. We couldn't escape it because, worked on a military base, lived on a military base, went to a CDC, a Child of us that are on a military base, like we could not escape the exposure. And until we asked for compassionate reassignment, and we got the hell out of there.
You had mentioned something to me a while back about after they did all these flushings and how they were just flushing into the grass, and there was the increased odor and people feeling sicker. You said something too about animals were just dropping dead in their yards. Did that sound?
Oh God, it was awful. And I'm not a pet owner, but like certainly I have, empathy. Yes, animals died. I remember going to visit this one lady who, was really struggling, and she, her house just reeked of fuel. And I remember like we didn't go in her house, but I just went to be with her and just sit in her front yard. And there were dead birds all over her front yard. Like, and they were also dumping. So there's a place, and I think it's important to mention, I think I mentioned this earlier, that it's not only military families that were impacted. So Capilina Beach Homes, which is over in Eva Beach where I lived before, is on the Navy's water system. It's not a Navy base anymore. They are owned like by a private, company or whatever, and it's open to the public now to live. But that water system is they still get water from the Navy drinking water system. I think it was some sort of agreement when they turned that, property over to the public. There were people who said so they were like dumping water into like the lagoons there at Capilina Beach Home. There was like dead fish everywhere, dead birds. Again, people's animals were dying. It was horrendous. And like, oh, by the way, if you're dumping into people's yards, like you have small kids, Paul, like my kids play with dirt. They think it's like the cool, like I can get them all the toys in the world, but they think playing with dirt and like hanging out in the grass is like the cool thing, right? And so our kids eat dirt, they play with dirt, and we fill up their, we lived in Hawaii, so we're filling up their like little backyard pools with the water hose. And I'd love to send you a picture or a video of like what our water looked like. It looked like, it reeked, and it also looked like there was like foam coming out of it, if you will. Like it just, yeah, you couldn't escape it. You couldn't escape it in your home or outside your home. And unfortunately, a lot of folks, lost their pets, and their own personal health,
Part of the reason I asked there, and again, I'm trying to keep this on quotable sources, is I was sitting watching a press conference that one of our senators put on here in Ohio several months back, in which he had a doctor from Ohio State University talking about burn pit studies that they're doing in mice populations. And one of the things he said that they prefer with mice is because they have a shorter lifespan, you can have a much smaller exposure time and simulate what it's like for people over a longer period of time. So again, that's like one of these things that to me is a big red flag of, are these dead animals a prognostic indicator of what your population is going to be experiencing as they go through their natural life cycle, which I'm not trying to be overly dramatic, but unfortunately I think is probably accurate. You were talking about how you got out of the house for a little while, and it sounded like you got it kind of swings towards the general attitude of the people who were dealing with this. You were given an email option to vacate the homes for a little while, but then you also received another email talking, kind of dressing this down and making it feel like you're being a leech on the system. And that kind of seems like it opens to where many of the attitudes that you experienced went. Would you mind just kind of summarizing that a little bit and then saying where your fight went to next with this?
Okay, so yeah, we had received an evacuation letter, which basically said, you have the option to move off base no matter where you live on the Navy water drinking system. And so it wasn't a mandatory evacuation, but essentially gave everyone the option to do so. And I'll be honest, right away, we didn't do so. And that was pretty early on. We were being told that Ford Island, where we lived, was not impacted. There was no indication that Ford Island was impacted at the time. And on or about, I think it was the 6th of December, I got an email from our chief of staff. So I worked for Special Operations Command Pacific. And this went out to every service member in our command that was basically like, you need to check your conscience. These hotels, they're not meant for a staycation. We need to save them for people who actually need them. And I'm like, you know, actually need them. What does that mean? You know, like anyone should have the option if they feel unsafe to be able to move, and they certainly shouldn't have like command telling you to check your conscience, you know. And so there were a lot of people, I remember, like there were some family members in my unit that were very upset about it. And I had one girl crying like, you know, Major Fine, I don't feel safe in my home, but I don't want to be those people that are looked at like I'm just, you know, using the system, or, you know, like it basically made us feel like there was this overall like thing that like the water is safe, people are just making a big deal of nothing, like folks are just going down to Waikiki, you know, sipping Mai Tais, you know, on the beach. And that just absolutely wasn't happening. I remember our deputy commander early on, I asked him to come to our hotel, and we had some things that we wanted to chat with him about, and, you know, just show him how much our family was struggling in the hotel. And I said, you know, sir, this email that went out by our chief of staff, like it made people feel a certain way. And this is how, and he could hear, like, I mean, I had two small kids. We were living in a small hotel room, you know, all hours in the morning. Like he came over really early. Like there was horns going off. Like you're living like a city. It's not glorious by any means, especially if you're there and you've been ripped away from your home and you're sick and all these things. And I said, you know, we've really got to change that narrative, because we're potentially making folks feel like they need to stay in their home. And because this email has gone out, it's making people feel like they shouldn't move out, and they shouldn't, you know, go to a safe environment because of the way that, you know, the perception of our command. And I think eventually they sort of changed the narrative with that. But that was another like opportunity that we had to be more supportive of families and to prioritize families' health and safety, where we really, really just downplayed it and made people like, when you say things like check your conscience, like we probably, maybe we should have ran that to the public affairs officer before we put that out to our entire command. But, you know, just like the email that we got from the base commander, getting an email like that just really downplays the significance and the magnitude of the situation. And yeah, I think that we got that one wrong as well. I sent you a recording, Paul, of a conversation that I had. And I think you may have heard me sort of describe that. And he said, well, Major Fight, you had an opportunity to move into a hotel. Why didn't you? And do you remember my response? I said, sir, I didn't really feel like I had an option. Like, yes, I was told, you know, that we could evacuate if we wanted, but then I have my own, you know, command team saying, you know, check your conscience on this. And so that was another thing. Like people then were blamed for not moving out right away. And it's like, you guys weren't being transparent. You were telling us our water was safe, but we could move out of abundance of caution. And then you've got command team saying, check your conscience. Like, you know, this really isn't an issue. You shouldn't be like utilizing these hotels. And so that's, I mean, you probably heard I got emotional in that. I'm like, sir, how dare you, you know, make me feel any worse for our decision not to move out immediately. Like we didn't feel like it was an option, you know, like we didn't, like, because of the perception of it, you know, and getting this email from our command, like we didn't feel like we should move, you know what I mean, right away. And so, yeah, just the messaging, how we treated families in the beginning, the lack of transparency, the lack of empathy, the lack of support, it was horrendous. It put people truly in a real compromising position when it just could have been handled so differently. And I think that we kept people in their contaminated homes for far too long. And that's just a result purely of, you know, I believe a lack of care from our leadership.
It's been the experience of people going through any of these toxic exposure battles that typically they are very adept at making it our fault for their poisoning us. And unfortunately, it's something that seems to continue because then, you know, when it comes towards the pathway of trying to get medical care, which you've discovered, people don't know what to look for. They don't know what to watch for. They just assume that, especially if you have a civilian looking at a veteran or a service member, that clearly they have PTSD. So this must be an issue that's in their head. I would suspect that in your case, being female, you've probably encountered a certain amount of people who seem to think that that's also a causative factor for your seeking help. And it just keeps going all the way up the chain to where Congress is like, well, we can't have these freeloaders, you know, like we had Rand Paul, who was trying to introduce his bill onto the PACT Act, or his amendment stating one of his opening salvos was talking about how prevalent asthma is in the community and how unfair it is that we should have to pay for it. But that completely overlooks the fact that asthma is actually an exclusion criteria from enlistment in the service. So theoretically, your population going in should be zero, and adult onset asthma isn't as common as we're seeing in the service. So, it's just kind of like this way of people trying to say, oh, look at all these folks. And it's depressing as shit because, I try not to swear on these, but so sorry. It's depressing because you have so many people, I think, who have the attitude of, well, I'm not that sick yet, so I don't feel like I should be a burden on the system. And then they're trying to perpetuate it further, which in this case could have helped to bring down the overall significance of this outbreak, if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
You recorded several of these meetings, and like the one you were describing just now, a lot of their responses, if not most of them, were less than satisfactory. So what happened as you kept going through and having more of these meetings and trying to get people to do their job?
Yeah, so you mentioned I did, and I think, like, Lord knows I've never been in a situation where I feel like I needed to record a conversation, but I quickly learned that, I was in a David and Goliath fight, and that there was, and what I've sort of uncovered throughout this crisis is that, and I've been a former commander, like, I appreciate the help and the resources and all the folks that, like, fly in and flock in to protect the leadership, right? And I believe that, to a point, we need to make sure that we do that, right? Like, we're all human, we're not perfect and whatever. But, like, that does not happen for the folks who are the victims of any circumstance, right? Like, you're just kind of left flapping on your own. And so yeah, I did. I felt like I needed to record, and I made sure, obviously, we got legal help, but Hawaii is Hawaii is a state that's a one-person consent. So wasn't doing anything illegal there, wasn't recording like in a skiff or anything like that. So, I made sure that these meetings were in a place that I could record. And I did. I just, I say I took off the uniform. I didn't really take off my uniform. I feel like I fulfilled my duty as a senior leader to go and have these hard conversations. I was an ROTC instructor at George Mason University for many years. And I remember speaking to our cadets who are now officers, right? They serve in the same ranks that I do, about having the intestinal fortitude to go forward and to having hard conversations and to making unpopular decisions sometimes. And I feel like, unfortunately, like, me coming forward and being outspoken and sort of demanding these meetings and holding people's feet to the fire and asking for accountability and transparency has been the unpopular decision. But it's one that I sleep fine with every single night because, again, I mentioned, like, I feel, not only as a mother and like my role in this as a mother, but then as a senior leader, I just feel like it's my duty to speak up for anyone who has been harmed, while serving in the service. And I think I mentioned to you this earlier, like, I'm a sexual assault victim advocate. I would do the same thing for, for victims of any circumstance, really. And speaking of that, that same chief of staff officer that I mentioned, I had a conversation with him about this when I got back to leave, and I sort of had some time to have some clarity. And I went in and I said to him, sir, like, I mean, he was just so ugly to me. He was like, Mandy, no one asked you to be a self-professed superhero here. And I said, sir, this is not for the, the fame of it all. Like, this is a horrendous situation. And, I'm not trying to save anyone. I'm just trying to do my job. And he's like, your job is here. And I was like, sir, like, I can't turn a blind eye to our fellow service members that are really, and their families that are struggling. And I said, you've put me on, like, I had an additional duty as one of their sexual assault advisors for the command. And I said, would you expect me to turn a blind eye if this was, if these folks were victims of sexual assault? And he said, well, their command would, have, people to help them. And I said, and if the command wasn't helping them? And he said, again, that's not your job, Major Find. And so, like, again, like, I just have been met with such resistance in working with leaders in the military to have empathy, to care, to, to stand up and say, this is wrong. And we have an opportunity to get it right. And, I've received a ton of criticism for speaking out and demanding better. And, this isn't me against the military. Like, I am so proud and honored to serve our country. And that's why, many folks are like, Mandy, why don't you just get out? And I'm like, why? That's unfair. I love being in the military. Like, I have been a cheerleader for the Army for many years. I've recruited for the military. I've been a commander. I've, like I said, been an ROTC instructor. I come from a long line of military leaders, and I love the military, and I love them. I love it so much that I want to see them get it right. And so this isn't me like F the military. This is me like, hey, I'm one of you. This has happened to me too. Let's look at the way that we're handling this. If we say, our motto in the Army is people first. People first, Paul. Like, and this is how real people are being treated in a crisis situation. It's beyond me. So, yeah, I've had a lot of tough conversations. I've been met with nothing but resistance. The responses that I get, as you mentioned, and as you've heard, in some of these recordings, have just been really hokey. They've been super canned, zero responsibility. Even like I asked for a letter to be sent to the Ford Island parent, like an apology, take some responsibility. A letter was sent on December 20th, so like an entire month after the spill. Not a single apology was given to parents. And I just think that like we've really lost the human factor in all of this. We've lost, the empathy that we should all have as senior leaders. And it's been disappointing. It's been hard. The conversations have been hard. The retaliation, the reprisal have all been very hard on top of everything else that I'm going through personally with my own family. But I just feel like if not me, then who else is, going to do it? And I'm not saying that I'm the only person in this fight. There are many, but there have been a few active duty service members, and for whatever reason, to protect their own job or, their career or the next, few days. Or I also just think that people handle things in different ways, and we all have our different strengths and weaknesses. And, and I have a voice that God gave me, and I'm using it, and I feel like I'm using it to do good. And, many people disagree with that, but I'm okay with that. I really am.
So you're having these recordings, you're having these fights, you wound up leaving Hawaii on compassionate reassignment. Where is the battle for all of this right now?
Well, we are in Colorado. We did get a compassionate reassignment. I haven't given up completely. I'm still encouraging military leaders to speak with me, and I have tons of ideas and suggestions on how we could get this right. And I keep getting, again, canned responses from our most senior leaders. We understand this is an important issue for you, Major Find. It's also an important issue for us. And those leaders, like, they're not meeting with real people and real families that have been impacted. And I've asked for that. Like, I went out to Washington back in early February. I think it's just a darn shame when, our congressional leaders want to meet with. Like, I met with many congressional leaders back then, and not a single Army leader, no one from the Department of Defense. That was really discouraging. Like, I flew out on my own accord, on my own dime, on my personal time to go and have these conversations to gain support, and not anyone from our, military ranks would be with me. I'm going back out to DC in 2 weeks' time, again, taking my own personal leave, going out as Mandy Find, not Major Find, and have asked since June to meet with, senior military leaders about Red Hill. And to date, I still don't have any meetings locked down with any of them. No one's willing to meet with me. And so now I'm just looking to speak to environmental and congressional leaders to gain help and support on this and how we can do better and take care of our families better. I've met with the administrator of the EPA. So I'm just focusing sort of my attention there. And if the military wants to get on board and they're interested in meeting with me or any other family members who have been impacted, we certainly welcome that. We haven't closed that door completely, but we've been fighting to be heard. And, the Secretary of the Navy has come out several times. I believe I saw the other day, the Secretary of the Air Force was, out, and, they're doing their due diligence to meet with senior leaders, but, hell, even, the vice president was out in Hawaii on a family vacation just a couple of weeks ago and didn't take the time to come over and meet or address Red Hill. The only thing that was said about Red Hill during her entire trip is when a couple of young girls from the community, Hawaii natives, approached her on a beach. And, it was good to know that she's tracking the situation because, no one is talking about this stuff publicly. Like, President Biden, our commander-in-chief has not, even made a statement about this, and we're his own people, and so we just, when I say we, again, not just me, but the folks who I am going to DC with, our hope is just that, in the absence of military leadership, meeting with us or taking the time to really sit down with families who have been impacted to hear from real families, we're just trying to go a different route to, to see change and to see things happen for, the people of Hawaii, our citizens who have been harmed by this crisis. And so, yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. We're here in Colorado, not a lot has changed. I mean, obviously we're out of this situation, which is a huge weight lifted off our shoulder, but, we're still dealing with ongoing symptoms. And we are, I would say the greatest thing about being in Colorado versus, on the island is that we're not dealing with the medical gaslighting and the fight on top of everything else that we're fighting to get referrals and to be, to have proper testing and treatment and proactive care. So that way, we're not living with this, fear of, I mean, we'll live with the fear, right? But we're not, the biggest thing for me is that when this thing first happened, I was given a lot of from the guy in the ER, from the doctor in the ER, right? Well, you realize, Major Fink, that if you still do this, you might still be poisoning your kid. And from the base command, well, why didn't you move out earlier? There's just been a lot of this, you mentioned, all this stuff on me. And I'm just you act as if this is my area of expertise and I'm supposed to know all of these things. I'm looking to you, the senior leaders who do have this information and who have known about it for quite some time, to push this information down to, our team, our soldiers, our military family. And so, I think some of the reason why I feel the way that I do to get all these medical appointments and to track all this stuff down is that I can never have to feel like that again, right? I don't have to the military is sort of forcing us to, well, they're going to put us on this registry. And then 10 years down the line, when all of our kids end up with type whatever cancer, then we just have to deal with it. I don't want to be 10 years down the road, Paul, and saying I could have done things so differently, or have someone say, well, why didn't you check on this stuff earlier? So now I'm running around like a chicken with my head cut off again, figured this out on my own. And I'm asking for doctors to check out A, B, and C with my kids so I can have a baseline so they can be monitored, since we do have, a known exposure. And I'm getting that support here. But the people in Hawaii that are still there, whether they're military or civilian families, are not getting that at all. We've been told by military medical, officials that we would just be opening Pandora's box. And, a bunch of us have paid out of pocket to get toxicology labs and stuff. And they're saying, well, this isn't a way to 100% tie it to the jet fuel exposure. And I'm thinking to myself, my kid's 1 year old. He has all of these harmful chemicals from jet fuel to everything else in his system. And do you think I'm just making him drink jet fuel out of his, sippy cup? No. You know what I mean? He has been exposed to this. He's lived in Hawaii for, his entire life. What do you mean there's no way to tie it to this directly? It's just the amount of gaslighting and dismissiveness that the folks in Hawaii are experiencing is just horrendous. And that's why, even though I'm here and we are getting medical help, as a leader and as a person who's sort of in this as an advocate, it doesn't mean I'm going to stop fighting for, my fellow service members and the families who are still back in Hawaii experiencing this horrendous crisis.
Would you be willing to go into a little bit, we've been talking about kind of the big picture, but obviously you're dealing with this as a human being, as a family member, as a mother, as a wife. Would you feel comfortable just talking about some of the impact that it's had on you and your family?
So this is a question that I get a ton, how has the water crisis impacted your family personally? And I say, at this point, I say in every freaking way possible, so, not only professionally, medically, mentally, financially, God, I just in our entire life has been turned upside down. And, the mental stress has probably been, the most trouble, not being able to sleep at night, it's you're constantly worried about this. You're, constantly stress and all the added stress, and the fear that you have, the inconvenience of it all. I mean, Paul, when we evacuated on December 13th from our home, we didn't just like move to one hotel and that was it. Like we moved 7 times as a result of this, to different hotel rooms. At one point, I took my kids back to see their grandparents to get out of the hotel for a while. Moved back to a different hotel, had to move out because of the holidays, because they were overbooked, moved back in our house, got sick again, moved back out, all the transition to move here to Colorado. Like it was 7 times. And just the inconvenience. And I say this all the time because like I really have trouble talking about like my own, personal family. Like our situation sucks. But truly, like knowing other people's stories, like our story pales in comparison to other family stories. But we have, I mean, as far as like the medical symptoms, we all have some of the similar things. Like we all got sick, we all had diarrhea issues, couldn't control our bowels. I mean, I was sitting in adult depends having meetings, like horrendous, right? We were all nauseous, sick, vertigo, headaches. Those are all sort of the things that we were all experiencing. And then as far as like individual family members, so my husband Patrick has just huge issues with like, he has a lot of GI related issues, a ton of like abdominal flank pain. The migraines are still very, prevalent in his life. And my husband can't even work right now because of how much pain he's in. He's had, a surgery, exploratory surgery, 5 different medical procedures to figure out what the heck's going on. We just got a diagnosis, which we are having additional testing done. He just had a brain scan, which another thing was found there. And until we get more information, I would just we'll do a follow-up or something. But we're starting to get answers. As far as my son, my kids are being seen by like 9 different specialists right now. And most of them are at Children's Hospital here in Colorado. But the kids are being seen by, dermatology just based off of their exposure to their skin. My son is being seen by pulmonology, a lot of behavioral health type issues with my daughter. They're both being seen by neurologists, immunologist. In fact, I'm going up this afternoon to Children's Hospital to see an immunologist. I think that's how you say it. Hematology, toxicology, pediatric specialist, like you name it. And I think I told you this before, like there's not a week that goes by that we're not at a doctor, at least, 5 or 6 times throughout the week. Yesterday, we, 2 appointments, the other day, 2 appointments before that. Today, another appointment this afternoon up in Denver. Like we live in the doctor's office. And for me personally, and, I have a hard time, like you hardly ever hear me say like, these are all my medical issues. But, and you know this, you understand this, like when we raised our right hand, when I raised my right hand, almost 20 years ago, with my first contract with the military, I gave my life, my body, my everything to the military. And so for me, I'm pissed, like I've had certain things that have happened to me. And, certainly when I got back from Afghanistan, I think I shared with you the infertility stuff. I had melanoma cancer. I've dealt with some things, but here we go again. Like we're on American soil, right? We're not in a combat zone. We are on American soil, poisoned by a military American asset and being treated like collateral damage on American soil. And nothing pisses me off more than that not only has this happened to, us service members, but our family members and the native people of Hawaii and just other civilian citizens who live in Hawaii. And so it makes me really upset. But for me, some of the things that I'm experiencing that I never had an issue with before this water crisis is, a significant amount of anxiety, as you can imagine, right? And I've had significant hearing issues. So, like we have to get tested every year, annual hearing exams. And so in March of 21, before this crisis impacted my family, I had perfect hearing. I'd never really had any hearing issues. Perfect hearing, perfect vision, no issues there. Well, I actually had to go to the hospital. Who goes to the hospital for ear pain? But I actually felt like a bullet had been shot in my eardrum, or I was convinced that my eardrum had ruptured because I was having so much ear pain. And of course, when I went to Tripler, which is the military base, a military hospital there in Hawaii, I was given like Sudafed, and they treated it like as if some sort of like sinus issue because there was no issues with my ears. And it continued. I had the ringing in my ear. I had pressure in my ear. I had so much pain, and I like could not hear, So I've had a lot of work done here at Air Force Academy, and turns out like I've had significant hearing loss, which is strange. Like there's a lot of studies out there about hearing loss when it comes to both noise exposure and jet fuel exposure at the same time. So if you were like a fueler or worked on an aircraft or whatever, but there's nothing, and I'm like a personalist, so like loud noise exposure is not part of my job, right? I sit behind a computer and whatever. So there's not a lot of studies out there for just jet fuel exposure. But there's belief that the tiny like hairs in your cochlea, I think it's what it's called. We were talking about this earlier, because of the chemical exposure, just kind of get burned off and could cause some of that tinnitus or tinnitus or however you say it. And I've got a brain scan coming up, and an inner ear canal scan coming up. I just got fitted for hearing aids, which at 37, I'm 38 years old now. I just had a birthday. To have to wear hearing aids just freaking sucks, right? Because I've never had an issue with hearing. I think I told you before I was hospitalized, I lost the ability to move my right leg, unexplained, significant back pain. And like, to be clear, like, I've jumped out of many of airplanes and did that life for a while in the 82nd, and so of course I've had, back pain like anyone else, but I used to get like a shot of Toradol in my butt and like keep it moving, like there's no issue. Like I've never had to be hospitalized for back pain or lost the ability to move any of my extremities. And, I've experienced that throughout this. So yeah, it's just a bunch of symptoms that we as a family have experienced since this crisis that we had never had before. I mean, I would say that in general, our family was very healthy. I always like to say I have like a rock hard immune system. My husband, would get the man flu every, a couple of times a year, but like, like we were never people who were just like really sick. And looking back on the past year that we were exposed, we were just constantly sick and constantly dealing with things that we had never, dealt with before this crisis.
Is there anything that we haven't hit on that you want to add?
No, I think a really important piece that I was able to put in there is you have to look it up, the Sophie Peacock Star Advisor thing, because that is huge, and that just dropped this week. Basically, it's a huge thing that's been on front page the past 2 days in the news, that they threw out a bunch of our samples in the beginning and that they weren't actually testing for jet fuel, knowing that the contaminant that we were all exposed with was jet fuel. They did TOC testing and not TPH testing until they started doing all the flushing. That's like huge.
What's next?
Going back to Congress in 2 weeks. We'll see how that goes. What'd you say?
Is that on the 17th?
So yeah, we're going to fly out 17th. Got some meetings scheduled for Monday the 19th. We've got that EPA event on the 20th, and then meeting with congressional leaders on the 21st and 22nd. I've left Friday open for military leadership meetings or, to go to the Pentagon, but at this point, nothing is secured with any military leadership, which is disappointing, but we'll see what happens. When we go back to Congress, in 2 weeks' time, we have, several folks that we're meeting with, and really 5 major talking points. The first is, we just want to know, we know that this funding has been allocated to Red Hill, but we want Congress to know, and we're not getting the medical care that we need. So where's the money for for research, for testing, for proactive medical care? And was a portion of that money supposed to be allocated for actual people, not just the asset itself or the cleanup of it? And if not, then we're going to ask for that, right? Like, I think that there needs to be a certain portion of money that is allocated for medical. And we have an opportunity we have a unique opportunity for the first time, like with burn pits, with 9/11 first responders, with Camp Lejeune, right? Like, you all, part of that, and me too, like, have fought that for many years, like for decades, some, to get symptoms associated with the exposure, right? We are real time right now. We have an opportunity to get ahead of some of this. And so that's like the biggest thing. That is why there's this huge push for proactive medical, intervention, if you will. And if there's not research, what they say there's not, then you know what, like, create a research team and like, let's get ahead of this. And we have an opportunity to do that now. So that's like our first and foremost. two, we want to talk a little bit about the PACT Act and see what room there is for Red Hill in the PACT Act, and what sort of legislation is out there for families impacted by any sort of toxic exposure on American soil. And so, to my knowledge, there's nothing out there for families. So that's, obviously an important topic of how we can make that happen, because I think that's important. And I also, just want to know how the PACT Act, because there is a bill for Camp Lejeune, right? Is there any room in there for Red Hill based off this toxic exposure? I think the answer is yes, but we'll see what that conversation looks like. And I think that would be obviously of interest to you all as well. And can't wait to talk with you about that afterwards. This is something that's like really personal to me, just being a human resources personalist and dealing with like pay and finance and stuff like that and regulations. And this just from being downrange, like when we put folks in harm's way, there is hazardous duty pay associated with it. There's imminent danger pay. Even if you're jumping out of airplane, jumping out once a quarter, you're still getting jump pay. There are all these incentive pays. And I thought from the very beginning, especially for I think I told you about this, junior service members who were put on these details to work with the water contamination flush systems, there was no hazardous duty pay or anything associated with that for them. And then also, not only for them, who I think are the most important like population here, but also any family who lived on the Navy water line who was subjected to living in a contaminated home while they were serving, I believe should get an additional pay. And Paul, like honestly, like people are like, maybe it's a drop in the bucket. It is, what is it? $150 for hazard pay and $225 for imminent danger pay. I'd have to go back and look at that. But it's a drop in the bucket. It's nothing. But for me, I'm a principle-based person, and it is a way to validate the harm that we put our service members in while they were serving in Hawaii. And so that's one thing I'm asking for congressional support on, to direct the military to do that. There are certainly funds for that. Another thing I'm meeting with specific congressional leaders to talk about culture and institutional change when it comes to retaliation and reprisal. And this is just something that's deeply personal to me, based on my role as an advocate for sexual assault, again, from being a previous commander and seeing things like this happen. And then now for me, filing for whistleblower protection back in February and seeing the lack of support that victims in any circumstance have once they make a complaint. And again, we sort of talked about how like the carpet is rolled out and there's all this support and everyone sort of flocks around the leadership when an accusation or a complaint is made. But you've got this victim who like has zero rights, who doesn't have a voice, who doesn't have the support that they need. And it's because regulations as they are currently written, I say, are written to protect the bully, not the victim. And so that's something that's just I'm very passionate about. Then the very last thing, and I've spoke a lot about this with Susan Wind, who is the organizer of this EPA event that I am speaking at. She comes from a different, area of toxic exposure, coal ash in North Carolina. Her daughter has had cancer, and she's just an amazing advocate for the toxic exposure community. And one thing that her and I both agree on is that we've got to do better about registries, and not medical registries. I'm talking home registries. So I think I mentioned when we moved to Hawaii, we had no idea about Red Hill. Like nothing. We'd never been there previously. We'd not been briefed on it. When we moved into our home, we were not tracking anything about a previous spill, nothing, right? We talked about PVC pipes and how this stuff kind of leaches onto that. Just like you move into a home and you get like a home inspection, right? You have visibility on that. You can also look up the crime rate, right? It's public knowledge. You can look up and see if there's a sex offender living right across from you because there's a sex offender registry. If you buy a used car, there are Carfax, right? And you have visibility on that. When you move into a military base house, you don't get any of that. So like there are people living, like many of us have moved off island, and guess what? Those houses that we lived in were contaminated, made our families sick. They either have no idea or they were not briefed that this home, many people got sick because of water contamination. And that's not something that we tell military families. And I think that that's wrong. And I think that folks, before they move into a military base house, should know the previous exposures, whether it's mold or water contamination or whatever it is. I think that we need to create a registry for military on-base housing to give, future residents that situational awareness. And so those are sort of the 5 topics that we are looking to cover and gain congressional support on when we go to Washington in a couple of weeks.
Awesome. Thank you for taking the time to talk with us about all this. I think your folks who are dealing with this are exceptionally lucky to have someone like you in the fight with this, to the point that I don't think they know how lucky they are.
Thank you.
I'll get this rolling out, and I can only speak for myself. I can't speak for Rosie or for anyone else, but I think that what you're dealing with is exactly along the lines of, quite frankly, what pisses us off and what we want to do something about. I think there's a few potential areas in which the PACT Act could be helpful. I think the biggest question is, will Congress and VA, DOD do what they're supposed to do with it? So all we can do on that one is try and find out. Not we go from there.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Paul, for having me on. I appreciate all the support that you've, given to me personally, and then just like Burn Pits 360 and just everyone within your community and your space, because we're just really in uncharted territory here. And so it's just been, it's been awesome that you guys have like kind of swooped in and you've paved the way for all of us, and you've just been extremely helpful and resourceful in helping, at least me, like guiding me through this. So I truly appreciate you having me on today, and then just being there as a friend and as, support system for us.
I've got a friend who used to serve in many branches of the service, and the way he usually puts it is semper serving.
Yep. Thank you so much, Paul. I hope you have a wonderful day.